The email arrived on a Tuesday, a stark white rectangle of possibility glowing against the chipped, stained wood of Alex's kitchen table. For weeks, that table had been a landscape of rejection final notices, overdue bills, and the crumpled ghosts of failed job applications. He'd been a contractor for years, his skills with electrical systems and structural maintenance once in high demand. But the steady work had dried up, leaving behind a quiet desperation that echoed in the empty rooms of his apartment. This email, however, was different. The sender was a nondescript government address, and the subject line was a single formidable word: opportunity. He read it 3 times, the words not quite sinking in. The United States government was offering him a short-term, high-compensation contracting position. The location was what made his breath catch in his throat: Fort Knox. The name itself was a synonym for impenetrable security, for legendary wealth buried deep within the earth. The pay was a number that could erase every one of those red-inked bills on his table, and then some. It was a lifeline, thrown to him from the most unexpected of shores. 2 days later, he found himself in a sterile, windowless office in a federal building in Louisville. A man in a crisp suit, who offered no name and wore an expression of practiced neutrality, slid a stack of papers across a polished metal desk. They were non-disclosure agreements, but that term felt insufficient. These documents were a labyrinth of legal absolutes, each clause more severe than the last. They spoke of treason, of espionage, of consequences measured not in fines but in decades of incarceration. He initialed every page, his signature a shaky scrawl at the bottom of each one. The pen feeling heavy as lead in his hand. The man collected the papers without a word, his silence more intimidating than any threat. Walking out of the building an hour later, the bright Kentucky sun felt alien on his skin. The weight of what he had just signed settled over him, a cloak of secrecy woven from legal jargon and implied danger. A thrill, bright and sharp, cut through the lingering anxiety. This was it. This was the break he had been praying for. The money was a tangible dream, a chance to start over, to be someone who wasn't constantly one missed payment away from collapse. Yet, beneath the surge of hope, a cold undercurrent of unease persisted. The sheer, overwhelming secrecy of it all felt wrong. Why would a simple maintenance job at a gold depository require such draconian vows of silence? What kind of work demanded a person sign away their right to speak of it, under penalty of being erased from the world? He pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the numbers in his bank account, the phantom feel of cleared debt. He was a contractor, down on his luck, and he had just been handed a golden ticket. He chose, for the moment, to ignore the chill that ran down his spine when he wondered what exactly that ticket was truly for. The morning air was crisp and carried the scent of cut grass and damp earth, a deceptively peaceful prelude to the fortress that lay ahead. Fort Knox was not just a building. It was a statement. A sprawling complex of granite and steel that seemed to absorb the very sunlight, casting long, imposing shadows. Alex presented his newly minted credentials at the first of many gates, his heart thudding a steady, nervous rhythm against his ribs. The guards were silhouettes of authority, their faces unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses, their movements economical and precise. They processed him with the detached efficiency of men handling a piece of machinery, scanning his badges, his retinas, and his fingerprints with devices that hummed and clicked in the morning quiet. Each successful check was a small relief, a click of a lock opening. Yet each one also felt like another bar sliding into place around him. Once inside the outer perimeter, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew still and cool, artificially controlled. The lighting was a uniform, shadowless fluorescence that gleamed off spotless linoleum floors and stark white walls. A stern-faced woman named Miss Gable, her hair pulled into a severe bun and her posture ramrod straight, became his guide. Her tour was a monotone recitation of facts and rules, her finger pointing out fire extinguishers and emergency exits with the same gravity. She used to indicate the bulletproof glass lining the corridors. They passed through cavernous hallways, where the only sound was the echo of their own footsteps, past vault doors that looked like they belonged in a Jules Verne novel, thick enough to withstand a siege. It was in one of these endless, sterile corridors that Alex first noticed the anomaly. A single, unmarked door, set back in an alcove, and lacking the polished brass placards that identified every other room. It was made of a dull, brushed metal, and instead of a handle, it featured a keypad and arm scanner of a more advanced design than any he had seen that day. Gable's narrative flowed smoothly past it, her gaze never wavering towards the recessed entryway, as if it were simply a part of the wall. But Alex's eyes lingered. There was an absolute finality to that door, a silent proclamation that whatever lay behind it was not for him, not for anyone on this sanitized tour. And then he heard it. A sound so deep and pervasive it was, less a noise and more a vibration, a physical sensation that hummed up through the soles of his boots and settled in his bones. It was a low, resonant thrum, a constant, droning note that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the complex. He paused, tilting his head slightly, trying to isolate it from the ambient whir and ventilation systems. Miss Gable noticed his hesitation and fixed him with a flat, questioning look. He muttered something about the impressive air conditioning, and she nodded, her expression unchanging. But he saw a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. A warning, perhaps, or simply impatience. The tour moved on, but the hum did not. It followed him, a subterranean heartbeat that pulsed through the gleaming, oppressive silence of the facility, a secret kept not behind locks, but in the very air he breathed, sparking a curiosity that felt both dangerous and utterly irresistible. The work was mundane, a deliberate descent into the facility's circulatory system of wires and conduits. For days, Alex traced faulty circuits and replaced aging electrical panels, his world shrinking to the color-coded maze behind the walls. The oppressive silence of the corridors was even more profound in these cramped maintenance shafts, broken only by the occasional snap of a breaker or the soft rustle of his own movements. The constant, low hum was louder here, a tangible pressure in the confined space that vibrated through the metal conduits he touched, a reminder of the mystery pulsing at the heart of this place. He worked with a focused diligence, the model contractor. All the while, his mind churned, replaying the image of that sealed door and the dismissive flicker in dismissive flicker. Gable's eyes. His assignment that afternoon was a persistent power fluctuation, affecting the lighting in the administrative wing's eastern corridor. The schematic pointed to a junction box in a little-used maintenance closet, a space so insignificant it was nearly forgotten. The closet was exactly as expected, a narrow, windowless room smelling of dust and ozone, filled with spare fluorescent light tubes and shelves of electrical components. The junction box was set high on the rear wall, and as Alex positioned his stepladder, his shoulder brushed against the sheetrock. The panel gave way with a faint, hollow sound, a subtle give that was entirely wrong for a solid wall. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Setting his tools down with deliberate quiet, he ran his fingers over the area. The texture was perfect, the beige paint seamless, but his knuckles tapped out a hollow echo. There, hidden in the shadowed seam where the wall met an air conditioning duct, was an almost imperceptible hairline crack outlining a perfect square about 2 feet by 2 feet. It was not on any blueprint he had studied. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic counter-rhythm to the facility's endless drone. This was not a design flaw or shoddy construction. The edges were too precise, the camouflage too perfect. This was intentional. For the rest of the day, a new and dangerous energy coursed through him. Every casual glance from a passing guard felt like a spotlight. Every echo in the hallway sounded like approaching footsteps. He completed his repairs with mechanical efficiency, his hands moving on autopilot while his mind was consumed by the hidden square. The thrill was a live wire in his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. Not since he was a boy exploring forbidden woods or climbing fences into abandoned lots. It was the thrill of rebellion, a direct and conscious violation of the countless rules and intimidating NDAs. They owned his signature, his compliance, his silence, but they did not, he realized with a jolt, own his curiosity. As he drove away from the fortress at the end of his shift, the image of the panel burned behind his eyes, more vivid than the setting sun. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now entwined with a fierce, defiant excitement. The sterile, controlled environment of Fort Knox had presented him with a flaw, a single loose thread in its tapestry of absolute control. He knew, with a certainty that felt both terrifying and inevitable, that he had to pull on it. He would come back. After hours, under the cover of a moonless sky, he would return to that dusty closet and see where that thread led. The decision was made not in a grand moment of courage, but in the quiet resolution of a man who had been handed a puzzle and found he could not simply look away. The moon was a shard of bone in a starless sky, offering no light, only a pale, cold witness to his transgression. Alex's truck was parked a mile down a deserted forestry road, its engine ticking softly as it cooled, a sound that seemed deafening in the profound stillness of the Kentucky night. He moved on foot through the dense, shadowed woods that bordered the facility, his every sense heightened to a razor's edge. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp soil, and the crunch of a single twig under his boot was a gunshot in the silence. He wore dark clothing and carried only a small backpack containing a powerful flashlight, a multi-tool, and a bottle of water that felt absurdly mundane against the enormity of what he was about to do. The outer fence was a 20-foot-tall scar of chain link and razor wire, but he had spent his first day observing more than just strange hums and sealed doors. He had noted a drainage culvert, half hidden by overgrown blackberry brambles, its grate rusted and loose. It was a vulnerability, a tiny crack in the fortress's armor. Now, on his hands and knees in the icy shallow water, he wriggled through the narrow concrete pipe, the cold seeping through his jeans and the smell of decay filling his nostrils. emerging on the other side. He was inside the perimeter. He lay still for a long moment, listening, his heart a frantic drum against the earth. Only the ever-present hum answered, louder now. A vibration he could feel through the ground. Navigating the complex itself was a study in shadow and memory. He avoided the lit pathways, sticking to the deep pools of darkness cast by the monolithic buildings, his body pressed against cold granite walls. He used the positions of security cameras he had memorized during his tour, moving in the blind spots between their slow, sweeping arcs. Each footstep was a calculated risk, each breath a conscious effort to be silent. The facility was a different entity at night, a sleeping giant whose dreams were filled with secrets, and whose guardians were unseen but palpably present. He reached the service entrance he had used during the day, its keypad glowing with a soft, green light. His fingers, slick with sweat, trembled as he input the code he had watched a guard use days before. A soft beep, a green light turned to yellow, and the magnetic lock disengaged with a heavy, metallic thunk that echoed in the empty hallway. He slipped inside, the door sighing shut behind him, sealing him in the absolute, tomb-like quiet of the interior. The hum was a physical force here, a pressure in his ears that made the silence feel heavy, expectant. The journey to the maintenance closet was a slow-motion nightmare. Every corner presented a potential confrontation. Every distant, mechanical whir could be the bootsteps of a patrol. He finally reached the unmarked door, his sanctuary of mundane supplies now transformed into a gateway. Inside, air was stale and thick with dust. He didn't dare turn on the overhead light. Instead, he clicked on his flashlight, its beam, a stark, white lance cutting through the darkness, illuminating swirling motes of dust. He found the panel immediately, the hairline crack a dark scar in the beam's focus. His multi-tool felt flimsy, a toy in his hands as he worked the flat edge into the seam. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened, and he feared it was sealed from the other side. Then, with a soft, gritty scrape, the panel gave. It was not hinged, but a simple plug, and it came away in his hands, revealing a square of absolute blackness. A wave of cold, dank air washed over him, carrying the smell of aged dust, wet concrete, and something else, something metallic and sharp, like ozone after a lightning strike. The opening was just large enough for him to squeeze through. He stood at the threshold, shining his light into the void. The beam revealed the beginning of a tunnel, its walls rough-hewn rock and crumbling mortar, descending at a shallow angle into the earth. It was ancient, a relic from a different era of the fortress, forgotten by blueprints and sealed away from prying eyes. His heart hammered in his chest, a wild mix of primal fear and electric anticipation. This was the point of no return. He took a deep breath of the foul, ancient air, stepped over the threshold, and let the darkness swallow him whole. The tunnel swallowed Alex whole, a throat of cold, damp stone that constricted around him. His flashlight beam was a fragile lifeline, dancing over walls of rough-hewn rock that glistened with a thin, black moisture. The air grew colder with every cautious step downward, the metallic, ozone-like scent intensifying until it coated the back of his throat. The omnipresent hum was no longer a distant vibration, but a physical force. Here, a deep, resonant thrumming that seemed to originate from the very rock, making the fillings in his teeth ache. He moved as if through water, each footfall deliberately placed, his ears straining for any sound beyond the pounding of his own heart and the subterranean drone. After what felt like an eternity of descent, the tunnel abruptly ended, opening into a vast, impossible space. Alex stopped dead, his breath catching. The chamber was colossal, so large that his flashlight beam could not find the far walls or the ceiling, vanishing into an abyss of shadow. He was standing on a narrow metal gantry, high above a floor that pulsed with a light of its own, and below him, stretching into the infinite darkness, was the source of the hum. It was a forest of machinery, but like none he had ever seen or imagined. There were no gears, no pistons, no recognizable engines. Instead, towering crystalline structures, obsidian black and veined with filaments of throbbing crimson light, rose from the floor like petrified trees. Between them, spheres of shimmering liquid metal floated, unsupported, rotating slowly and silently, their surfaces swirling with intricate, non-Euclidean patterns. Arcs of silent blue-white energy jumped between the spheres and the crystals in a chaotic, mesmerizing dance. The air itself felt thick, charged, resistant to movement. The light these structures emitted was not illumination, but a manifestation of raw power, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to move with a sentience of their own. The sound was a symphony of wrongness, a deep, organic pulsing woven through with high-frequency whines that hovered just at the edge of hearing. His mind reeled, trying to categorize the sight, to fit it into a known framework. This was not a gold repository. This was not a vault, a bank, or a military stockpile. The sheer, staggering scale of the technology was alien, its purpose utterly inscrutable. He scanned the cavern, his beam sweeping across the impossible landscape, searching for the one thing that was supposed to be here, the one justification for all this security, all this secrecy. He looked for stacks of gold bars, for gleaming bullion, for the legendary wealth of a nation. There was none, not a single brick, not a solitary coin. The floor was a complex web of glowing conduits and polished, non-reflective metal. The wealth of Fort Knox, the very reason for its mythos, was a phantom, a decoy. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, draining the strength from his legs. He gripped the cold railing of the gantry, his knuckles white. The gold was a lie, a beautiful, glittering story told to the world to hide the terrifying, pulsating truth buried beneath it. His financial struggles, his hope for a fresh start, the NDAs he had signed had all been for this. He was not a contractor fixing lights. He was a janitor mopping the floors outside a cathedral to something he could not comprehend. The unease he had felt since the beginning crystallized into a solid leaden dread in his gut. He was not just in over his head. He was adrift in an ocean of secrets whose depths he could not begin to fathom, and the safety of the shore was a memory that had just been erased. The sheer mind-bending scale of the chamber below threatened to swallow Alex's sanity. He fumbled in his pocket, his movements clumsy and frantic, his fingers numb with a cold that had little to do with the damp air. He needed proof, something tangible to anchor this nightmare in reality, to prove he wasn't losing his mind in the bowels of this granite mountain. His phone felt like a child's toy, a flimsy piece of consumer plastic utterly out of place in this cathedral of alien engineering. He raised it, his hand trembling, and pointed its camera lens at the pulsating crystalline structures and the floating spheres of liquid metal. The screen flickered, a mess of digital static in blooming, impossible colors. He tapped the shutter icon. Nothing happened. He pressed it again, harder, his thumb jamming against the glass. The screen wavered, the image of the machinery distorting as if seen through heat haze. Then the phone went completely black. A cold dread, colder than the tunnel's air, seeped into him. He pressed the power button, held it, shook the device. It was dead, utterly unresponsive, as if the very energy saturating the chamber had reached out and snuffed its delicate electronics. It wasn't just a drained battery, it was an erasure. The fortress's secrets were not merely hidden, they were protected, guarded by something that actively defied documentation. Panic began to prickle at the edges of his vision. He couldn't leave with nothing. His eyes, desperate for anything to record, fell upon the surfaces of the nearest machinery, etched into the bases of the obsidian crystals, and woven into the swirling patterns on the metal spheres were symbols. They were unlike any language or scientific notation he had ever seen, a series of angular glyphs, interlocking spirals that hurt to look at for too long, and geometric shapes that seemed to shift in the pulsating light. They were a language of pure energy, a code for a physics that did not belong to his world. Driven by a desperate primal need to capture something, he dropped to his knees on the cold metal gantry, his backpack scraping against the grate. He pulled out a small notepad and a pencil, the ordinary tools of his trade, now feeling like ancient relics. He began to sketch, his hand moving quickly, trying to transcribe the impossible shapes before his mind could reject them. He drew the sharp, aggressive angles of one glyph, the hypnotic, never-ending curve of a spiral that seemed to contain smaller versions of itself, a series of interconnected cubes that defied perspective. The lead scratched against the paper, a tiny human sound swallowed by the cavern's monumental hum. As he worked, a profound and chilling isolation settled over him, heavier than the mountain above. He was utterly alone. The world above, with its bills, its traffic, its sunsets, felt like a distant dream, a fragile illusion. This chamber, this pulsating, silent heart of wrongness, felt more real than anything he had ever known. The symbols he was sketching were not just markings on metal. They felt like the fundamental syntax of this new, terrifying reality. He was an illiterate man, copying a sacred text, unaware of its meaning, but certain of its power. The dread was no longer just about being caught. It was a philosophical vertigo, a cracking of the very foundations of his understanding. What was Fort Knox? What was gold? What was reality, if it could contain a place like this, humming just beneath the surface of the everyday world? He closed the notepad, the pencil sketch, feeling pathetically inadequate, a message in a bottle thrown into an ocean of the unknown. He had his clue, but it was a clue that pointed only to a deeper, more terrifying darkness. The symbols from the chamber were burned into Alex's mind, a silent, screaming script that played behind his eyelids every time he blinked. Returning to the mundane rhythm of his daily work felt like trying to act in a play after having seen the stagehands and the wires, the flimsy backdrop of the set. The fluorescent light seemed harsher, the hum of the ventilation more sinister, and the cheerful, mindless chatter of his co-workers felt like a scripted performance from a world that no longer existed. He moved through his tasks with a robotic detachment, his body going through the motions of replacing light ballasts and tightening conduit connections, while his soul remained deep underground, staring into the pulsating heart of the impossible. It was in the break room, amidst a smell of stale coffee and microwaved pasta, that the first overt warning came. Mark, a senior electrician with a face etched by years of quiet service and a perpetual weary expression, slid into the vinyl seat opposite him. Mark was a man who had always been friendly in a distant, professional way, but today his demeanor was different. He stirred his coffee slowly, the spoon clinking a soft, rhythmic alarm against the ceramic mug. He did not look at Alex directly, instead keeping his eyes fixed on the swirling liquid in his cup. His voice was a low, almost inaudible murmur, meant for Alex's ears alone. He spoke of the importance of routine, of keeping one's head down and one's curiosity firmly in check. He mentioned with a casualness that was anything but casual, a contractor from a few years back, a man who had asked too many questions, who had been seen in places he had no reason to be. He was gone now, Mark said, the words dropping like stones into the quiet between them. Not fired, just gone. The company had cited a family emergency, and his tools were collected and his locker cleared out before the end of the shift. Mark finally lifted his gaze, and in his eyes Alex saw no malice, only a flat, weary caution, a silent plea to be smart, to be blind. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but it transformed the facility around Alex. The walls, once merely imposing, now felt sentient. The security cameras were no longer passive recording devices, but unblinking judgmental eyes. Every reflective surface, the polished floor, the glass of a firearm case, became a potential mirror for a watcher standing just behind him. He began to notice patterns he had previously ignored. A guard who seemed to walk the same circuit past his work area with improbable frequency, the way certain colleagues would fall silent a little too quickly when he entered a room. Paranoia, once a seed, now bloomed into a thorny, choking vine. He found himself double-checking his own movements, rehearsing casual expressions in his mind, ensuring his body language projected nothing but bored compliance. Trust, a commodity he had never thought much about, became a luxury he could not afford. A friendly smile from his secretary felt like a trap. An offer of help from a foreman, a possible test of his loyalty. He ate his lunch alone, his back to a corner, his eyes scanning the room, seeing potential enemies in every face. The weight of the secret he carried was no longer just intellectual. It was a physical burden, a constant, low-grade terror that tightened his shoulders and sat like a stone in his gut. He was a mouse in a maze, acutely aware that the scientists were not just observing, but were actively adjusting the walls, and that one wrong turn, one moment of visible curiosity, could mean the experiment was over. The watchful eyes were everywhere, and he was now living his life squarely in their sights. The public library in the nearby town of Radcliffe was a sanctuary of normalcy, a world of quiet whispers and the soft scent of old paper that felt a million miles from the hum and paranoia of the fortress. Sunlight streamed through tall, grimy windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the warm, still air. Alex sat hunched in a secluded carrel, the wood grained, laminate cool. Beneath his forearms, before him lay his notepad, open to the page of meticulously copied symbols. The angular glyphs and impossible spirals, so stark and menacing in the chamber's pulsating light, looked bizarre and out of place here, surrounded by the orderly spines of history books and romance novels. They were a scream from another world, muffled by the gentle hush of the reading room. He started with the obvious, searching online databases and local historical archives for anything related to Fort Knox architecture, secret tunnels, or unusual construction projects. The results were a bland recitation of official histories, tales of gold transfers and patriotic security, a perfect, polished facade. The symbols yielded nothing in standard symbol dictionaries or cryptographic references. They were ghosts in the machine, absent from every sanctioned record. Frustration began to knot his shoulders. He was chasing a shadow, and the shadow was deepening. Driven by a growing desperation, he moved to the library's physical stacks, to the dim, forgotten aisles housing books on fringe science, conspiracy theories, and declassified government projects. The air here was thicker, smelling of mildew and neglect. He pulled down heavy cloth-bound volumes with titles that spoke of UFOs and psychic warfare, his skepticism warring with his need for any clue. It was in a dog-eared, self-published compendium from the 1980s, its pages yellowed and brittle, that he found it. The book was a rambling, poorly typeset mess, but tucked between chapters on remote viewing and alien autopsies was a brief cryptic section. The heading read, Project Janus and the Philadelphia Riff, Suppressed Experiments in Spatial Topology. The text was a paranoid jumble, but certain phrases leapt out, searing themselves into his mind. It spoke of wartime experiments aimed at rending the fabric of local space-time, of creating temporary, dimensional gateways for tactical advantage. The experiments, the book claimed, were catastrophic, resulting in psychological scarring of personnel and unstable topological anomalies that were sealed away. The author, writing under a pseudonym, claimed the research was never truly abandoned, only buried, its technology hidden in plain sight within the nation's most secure facilities. And there, nestled in a paragraph describing the theoretical energy signatures of such a rift, was a crude, hand-drawn illustration. It was a simplified version, but unmistakable. One of the interlocking non-Euclidean spirals he had sketched in his own notepad. A cold that had nothing to do with the library's air conditioning settled deep in Alex's bones. The frantic theories of a crackpot had just collided with the pulsating, alien reality he had witnessed. Dimensional rifts, spatial topology. The words were science fiction, but they fit the terrifying illogical machinery perfectly. The gold wasn't just a decoy for a secret weapon. It was a blind for something far more profound. Something that challenged the very nature of reality itself. The hum wasn't just the sound of powerful engines. It was the sound of the universe being stitched shut, or perhaps torn open. He slowly closed the book, the soft thud echoing in the silent aisle. The weight of the knowledge felt physical, a leaden cloak draped over his shoulders. This was no longer just a secret. It was forbidden knowledge, the kind that came with a price. He looked at his own hands, at the ordinary lines on his palms, and felt a profound disconnect. He had peered behind the curtain of the world and seen the scaffolding, the chaotic, terrifying machinery that held everything together. The simple act of walking out of the library, of driving back to his apartment, of existing in the mundane world, now felt like an elaborate act. He carried a truth that could unravel everything, and in that moment, he understood the true cost of his curiosity. It wasn't just his job or his freedom that was at risk. It was his very understanding of what was real. The library's revelation had turned Alex's world into a house of cards, each fact of his previous life now balanced on a foundation of terrifying uncertainty. He moved through his assigned duties at Fort Knox like a phantom, his body performing the rote tasks of a maintenance electrician, while his mind was a maelstrom of dimensional rifts and fractured physics. The oppressive hum was no longer just a sound. It was the audible strain of reality itself, a constant reminder that the world was not as solid as it seemed. The paranoia was a living thing now, coiling in his gut, whispering that every glance from a guard, every casual question from a supervisor, was a prelude to his own vanishing. He was a man holding a lit match in a room filled with invisible gas, waiting for the explosion. It was this desperate, gnawing need for confirmation that drove him back into the tunnels. The risk was astronomical. A gamble with his freedom and perhaps his life, but the alternative living with the screaming, unverified truth was a form of madness in itself. He waited for a night shrouded in a heavy, drizzling rain, the weather providing a blanket of auditory cover. The journey through the woods, the crawl through the drainage culvert, the tense navigation of the silent corridors. It was all a grimly familiar ritual now, performed with a heart that hammered not with excitement, but with a grim, fatalistic resolve. The hidden panel in the maintenance closet slid open with the same gritty protest. The cold, ozone-tainted air of the tunnel washed over him like a wave from a forgotten grave. He descended, his flashlight beam a trembling eye in the consuming darkness, the hum growing with every step until it was a physical pressure in his skull. He did not go to the gantry overlooking the vast chamber this time. That sight was burned into his memory. Instead, he turned down a narrower, lesser tunnel that branched off from the main passage, one he had noted on his first frantic exploration, but had been too overwhelmed to investigate. This corridor was different, older and more neglected. The walls were bare rock, slick with a dark, viscous dampness. The air was thick with the smell of decay and long-settled dust. After 50 yards, the tunnel ended in a small, rough-hewn alcove. It was not a natural formation. Tool marks scarred the walls, and in the center sat a small metal footlocker, rusted and streaked with grime. It looked like a relic from a war long past, utterly out of place in this temple of alien technology. The lock was a simple, heavy-duty padlock, crusted with corrosion. A surge of adrenaline, sharp and clean, cut through his dread. Using the pry bar from his multi-tool, he wedged it between the lock's shackle and the body. With a groan of protesting metal and a shower of orange rust, the lock gave way, clattering loudly onto the stone floor. The sound echoed sharply in the confined space, and he froze, listening for any response from the depths. Only the hum answered. He lifted the lid. Inside, protected from the worst of the damp by the sealed metal, was a journal. It was a standard issue, government-style notebook, its green cover stained and warped with age. He lifted it out with reverent, trembling hands. The first page bore a name, written in a firm, precise hand. Dr. Aris Thorne, project physicist. The date was from over a decade ago. Alex's blood ran cold. This was the ghost. This was the man Mark had spoken of, the one who was just gone. He sank to the floor of the alcove, his back against the cold rock, and opened the journal. The entries began with the clinical excitement of a scientist on the brink of a monumental discovery. Dr. Thorne wrote of the stabilizer, of its power to reinforce local space-time. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. The precise script began to waver. Thorne wrote of anomalous readings, of resonance leaks. He began to use the phrase that made Alex's skin crawl. Tears in reality. He described fleeting glimpses of otherwares in the periphery of his vision, of hearing whispers that were not sound, but conceptual echoes from beyond the veil. The journal detailed secret, unsanctioned experiments Thorne had conducted, attempts to map the topology of these tiers. The final entries were a frantic, barely legible scrawl, filled with terror and a desperate failing grip on sanity. It watches through the tiers. One line read, "The gold is the anchor, but the stabilizer is the lock, and the lock is straining." Alex closed the journal, his hand shaking so badly he could barely hold it. He was not the first. He was walking a path already blazed by a man who had been broken by the truth. The fear was paralyzing, a cold stone in his chest. But intertwined with it was a fierce, burning determination. Aris Thorne had been silenced, his work buried in a rusty locker in the dark. But Alex had found it. He was no longer just a curious contractor. He was a successor, an inheritor of a terrible legacy. The ghost in the machine had spoken, and its warnings fueled not a desire to flee, but a resolve to understand, to expose the terrifying truth that Fort Knox was not a vault for wealth, but a cage for something unimaginable. The journal felt alive in Alex's hands, a cold, pulsating thing that seemed to bleed its former owner's terror directly into his own bloodstream. He sat frozen in the alcove, the rough-hewn rock, a hard, unyielding presence at his back, the only light his trembling flashlight beam, illuminating the desperate script of a man being systematically unmade. He began to read in earnest, starting from the beginning, and with each turned page, Dr. Peage, Dr. Aris Thorne's descent was charted in heartbreaking, terrifying detail. The early entries were a marvel of scientific precision, filled with complex equations and neat, annotated diagrams of the very machinery Alex had seen. Thorne wrote of the M-theoretic stabilizer with a sense of awe, describing it as humanity's greatest, most secret achievement, a device designed not to create energy, but to enforce the fundamental laws of physics in a localized area. He called it a bulwark against the tide of cosmic chaos, a dam holding back an ocean of unreality. The gold, he explained, was not merely a decoy. Its unique atomic stability and density made it the perfect anchor, a physical and symbolic counterweight to the destabilizing forces the machine managed. Alex felt a flicker of grim understanding. The wealth of nations was not stored here. It was used as a paperweight for reality itself. But then, the tone began to curdle. Thorne's neat handwriting developed a slight, anxious slant. He documented resonance spikes, moments when the stabilizer's field would flicker. During these events, he wrote of seeing things. At first, they were fleeting, a shadow that fell in the wrong direction, a whisper of movement in an empty corridor, a patch of wall that seemed to ripple like water. He dismissed them as stress-induced hallucinations, the price of working in such a high-tension, energetically saturated environment. Alex's own skin crawled with a sympathetic dread, remembering the pervasive feeling of being watched, the unnatural shifts in the chamber's light. The journal's middle section was a chronicle of a mind at war with itself. Thorne's entries became more personal, less about the machine, and more about its effects on him. He wrote of crushing isolation, of being unable to speak of what he witnessed to colleagues who seemed willfully blind. He felt the walls of his own sanity thinning, becoming as permeable as the space-time the stabilizer was meant to fortify. He described one particularly harrowing event, where, during a major resonance leak, he saw the entire chamber warp. The floating metal spheres elongated into impossible taffy-like strands, and the crystalline structure seemed to be looking at him with a cold, geometric intelligence. He heard a sound that was not a sound, a pressure of meaning that flooded his mind with images of vast, lightless spaces and things that moved in angles that should not exist. The final pages were the true pages of fear. The script evolved into a frantic, spidery scrawl, the words tumbling over one another in a desperate race against his own unraveling. He was no longer just seeing things. He was certain he was being seen. It watches through the tears. He had written, and now he elaborated. It is not one thing. It is a presence from the place the stabilizer holds back. It knows I can perceive it. My curiosity has made me a beacon in the silence between worlds. He stopped sleeping, terrified of his own dreams, which were no longer dreams, but incursions. He believed the facility's security wasn't just to keep people out, but to keep him in, to contain the knowledge that was poisoning him. The last coherent entry was a single, stark sentence that made Alex's blood freeze. The hum is not the sound of the machine working. It is the sound of the thing on the other side, pushing back. Alex closed the journal, the soft rustle of the pages like a dying man's last breath. He was shivering uncontrollably, not from the cold of the tunnel, but from a soul-deep horror. He wasn't just reading the words of a madman. He was reading a prophecy. He understood Thorne's isolation with a painful, intimate clarity, the terror of knowing a truth so vast and awful that it cannot be shared, the horror of feeling the very fabric of your perception fraying at the edges. Thorne's fear was no longer confined to the yellowed pages. It had seeped out, a psychic stain that now saturated Alex's own mind. He was not just following in Thorne's footsteps. He was wearing his shoes, feeling the same ground give way beneath him. The ghost had not just spoken. It had reached out from the past and placed its icy hand on his shoulder, and Alex knew, with a certainty that left no room for doubt, that his own descent had already begun. The ghost of Dr. Shares. Iris Thorne haunted Alex's every waking moment. The journal's frantic script was a whisper in his mind, its warnings echoing in the facility's constant, droning hum. He moved through the next few days as a man already condemned. His nerves stretched to their breaking point. Every casual interaction felt like an interrogation. Every glance from a coworker, a silent accusation. He expected the hammer to fall at any second, for a hand to clamp down on his shoulder and drag him into the same silent oblivion that had claimed Thorne. The paranoia was a cage, and he was rattling its bars with every forced, normal breath. The summons came not with drama, but with bureaucratic chill. A single line on the daily work order schedule, printed beside his name. Report to Security Office B12. 10 a.m. The words were innocuous, but they felt like a death sentence. The walk to the office was a march to the gallows. The sterile, white corridors seemed to narrow, the fluorescent lights humming with a malicious intensity. He passed guards, whose faces were masks of impersonal authority, and he wondered if they knew, if they were all part of the machine that ground down curious men into dust. Office B12 was as stark and unadorned as he had imagined. A metal table, 2 chairs, and a large, one-way mirror that he knew hid observing eyes. 2 men waited for him. One was large, with a military bearing and a face that looked carved from granite. The other was smaller, leaner, dressed in a cheap suit, with eyes that were pale, calculating, and devoid of warmth. They introduced themselves as Agents Miller and Shaw. They did not offer to shake his hand. The questioning began with a deceptive softness. Shaw, the lean one, did most of the talking, his voice a calm, monotone instrument. They asked about his work, his routine, his impressions of the facility. They were establishing a baseline, he realized, watching for the slightest twitch, the most minuscule hesitation. Then the tone shifted, imperceptibly but unmistakably. Miller, the granite-faced man, leaned forward, his presence suddenly filling the small room. They had noticed, they said, some anomalies in his access logs. A keypad entry to the administrative wing after hours coinciding with a minor power fluctuation his work order had been meant to address. They had reviewed security camera footage that showed him moving through corridors that were not on his approved route, his body language tense, his head on a swivel. They phrased it all as simple administrative follow-up, a matter of procedure, but the subtext was a screaming accusation. They knew he had been somewhere he shouldn't have been. They just didn't know how deep he had gone. Alex's heart was a frantic bird beating against his ribs. He could feel the cold sweat gathering at the small of his back. This was it, the moment Thorne's journal had warned him about. He called upon every ounce of his will, forcing his breathing to remain even, his hands to lie still on the cold metal table. He had rehearsed this lie in the dark hours of the night. He admitted to the after-hours entry, framing it as a contractor's overzealous dedication. He claimed the power fluctuation had been more persistent than reported, and he had returned unofficially to double-check his work, not wanting to file a faulty completion report. It was a flimsy story, riddled with holes, but he delivered it with a convincing blend of professional pride and slight embarrassment. He mentioned the stress of the new job, the intimidating security, his desire to prove himself. He was just a guy, trying to do good work. He watched their eyes as he spoke, searching for any sign of belief or dismissal. Shaw's pale gaze remained unreadable, a placid lake hiding predators. Miller's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence that followed his explanation was the most terrifying sound Alex had ever heard, a void that threatened to suck him in. They asked a few more perfunctory questions, circling back to the same points, testing the consistency of his story. He held the line, his lies tasting like ash, in his mouth. Finally, Shaw closed the folder on the table. There would be no more late-night work, he said. His security clearance was being temporarily downgraded. Effective immediately, he was reassigned to exterior maintenance fence line repairs, groundskeeping, duties that kept him far from the sensitive heart of the complex. It was a professional demotion, a slap on the wrist, but it felt like a reprieve from an execution. They were not arresting him. They were sidelining him, isolating him. He was dismissed. The walk out of the office was a blur, his legs moving on autopilot. He felt no triumph, only a cold, hollow dread. He had lied convincingly, but he had not convinced them. He had seen it in Shaw's final flat stare. They did not believe his story. They simply had no concrete proof of a greater crime. His reassignment was not an acquittal. It was a strategic retreat. They were cutting him off from the source of his curiosity, putting him out in the open where he could be watched more easily. The net had not been thrown. It was being drawn tighter, slowly, methodically, and he was now acutely, painfully aware of every single thread. He was in a box, and the walls were quietly, inexorably, closing in. The reprieve was an illusion, a thin sheet of ice over a bottomless black lake. The reassignment to exterior duties was not a second chance. It was a cage with wider bars. Alex spent his days under the open sky, repairing chain-link fences and clearing drainage ditches, all under the unblinking gaze of the perimeter towers. The hum was fainter out here. A distant, persistent toothache, but the journal's words were a scream in his mind that distance could not mute. Every glance from a guard felt like a confirmation of Dr. Tomfirmation, of Dr. Thorne's fate. He was being marinated in his own paranoia, left to stew in the knowledge that he was a bug under a microscope, his every movement tracked and analyzed. The slow, grinding pressure of waiting for the other shoe to drop was a torture more refined than any interrogation. He could not live like this. The fear was a corrosive acid, eating away at him from the inside. To simply walk away, to collect his pay and vanish into the obscurity of his old life, was an impossible fantasy. The truth he carried was a cancer. If he did not excise it, it would consume him just as it had consumed Iris Thorne. The journal's final, desperate scrawl was a warning and a challenge. Thorne had been broken because he had been alone, because his evidence was trapped in his own deteriorating mind. Alex would not make the same mistake. He needed proof irrefutable, tangible, undeniable, proof that could survive the dismissive label of conspiracy theory. A shaky pencil sketch and a dead man's journal would not be enough. He needed to capture the heart of the madness itself. The plan that began to coalesce in his mind was not born of courage, but of a desperate final resignation. It was the last, reckless gamble of a man with no good options left. He would make one final, definitive infiltration. Not to the gantry, not to the alcove, but deeper. The journal had hinted at lower levels of primary resonance conduits and containment fields that lay beneath the main chamber. That was where the true source of the phenomenon would be. The engine at the center of the engine. He would go there. He would use a device immune to the chamber's energy-damping field. An old, fully mechanical film camera he had found in a pawn shop. Its operation reliant on springs and gears, not delicate silicon. He would load it with high-speed black and white film, hoping its chemical simplicity could capture what digital eyes could not. He spent his evenings in his apartment, the blinds drawn, stealing his resolve. He studied the journal not for its horror, but for its clues. Thorne had sketched a rough, frantic map of the lower accessways, scribbled in a margin during his final days. It showed a maintenance shaft, hidden behind a false wall in a sub-basement storage room, that led straight down. It was the most dangerous route, the most exposed, the one most likely to be monitored or trapped. It was also the most direct. He memorized the path until he could see it when he closed his eyes. He checked and rechecked the vintage camera, the solid weight of it a comfort in his hands. This was it. There would be no more research, no more cautious probing. This was a single, all-or-nothing plunge into the abyss. He was not going down to satisfy his curiosity anymore. He was going down to steal a piece of the abyss itself and bring it back into the light. Failure meant becoming another ghost. Success meant becoming a target for forces he could scarcely imagine. There was no good outcome, only a necessary one. The decision settled over him, not as a surge of adrenaline, but as a cold, hard, and absolute calm. The fear was still there, but it was now a tool, a sharpening stone for his focus. He was a man, walking to the edge of a cliff, and his only choice was to jump. The night was a conspirator, its darkness thick and velvety, swallowing the sound of Alex's careful footsteps as he moved through the familiar, suffocating woods. The air was heavy with the promise of rain, and a low mist clung to the earth, blurring the harsh lines of the fortress in the distance. This time, his approach was different. There was no fumbling uncertainty, no thrill of rebellion. His movements were economical, precise, the actions of a man executing a final, desperate script. The crawl through the drainage culvert was a cold, wet baptism, the grime a fitting anointment for the sacrilege he was about to commit. He emerged inside the perimeter, not as an intruder, but as a ghost returning to its haunt, his body humming with a grim, fatalistic energy. Navigating the interior was a deadly ballet, performed in absolute silence. He avoided the main corridors entirely, slipping through service ducts and ventilation access panels, his mind a perfect three-dimensional map of the facility's blind spots and patrol schedules. The security seemed more pronounced tonight, the red lights of the cameras like malevolent, unblinking stars in the gloom. He could feel the weight of their gaze, a tangible pressure against his skin. But he moved with the predator's patience, flowing from one pool of shadow to the next. He was a needle threading its way through a labyrinth of light, his goal a single point in the deep, subterranean dark. He found the sub-basement storage room exactly as Thorne's journal had described. A cavernous space filled with forgotten equipment, shrouded in dusty tarps, smelling of rust and disuse. The false wall was behind a stack of corroded chemical drums, a section of sheetrock that yielded to the pressure of his multi-tool with a soft, splintering crack. Behind it was not another tunnel of rough-hewn rock, but a stark, metallic shaft, its walls lined with glowing blue conduits that pulsed in time with the ever-present hum. A series of rungs, cold and slick with condensation, descended into a darkness that seemed to swallow the light from his flashlight. This was not a forgotten relic. This was a maintained artery, a direct line to the facility's still beating, unnatural heart. The descent was an eternity. The hum grew from a vibration into a physical force, a pressure that made his ears pop and his vision swim. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. The metallic, ozone scent was overpowering here, so strong he could taste it on his tongue, a flavor like a lightning strike in spoiled meat. He climbed down, hand over hand, the rungs biting into his palms, each one taking him further from the world he knew and deeper into a reality that was actively hostile to human perception. He reached the bottom and stepped out onto a grated catwalk. The space that opened before him dwarfed the chamber he had first discovered. This was not a room filled with machinery. It was a single, colossal machine. The walls, the floor, the distant, invisible ceiling, everything was a complex, interlocking system of the same obsidian crystal and liquid metal. The floating spheres here were larger, their swirling patterns more complex and hypnotic, moving in orchestrated, intelligent dances. Between them, the arcs of energy were not random, but formed intricate, shifting lattices of blue-white fire, weaving a cage of light around a central, throbbing void. The sound was a chorus of wrongness, a deep, chthonic groaning woven through with crystalline chimes, and a high-pitched whine that felt like a drill bit against his sanity. And there were signs of activity. Recent activity. Panels in the crystalline structures were open, revealing interiors of impossible geometry, with tools of shimmering light-based energy hovering nearby, performing adjustments without a visible hand to guide them. On a console that seemed grown rather than built, holographic schematics flickered, displaying equations that made his mind recoil. But most chilling were the containment fields. In recessed alcoves among the walls, shimmering, opaque energy barriers held things, vague, shifting shapes that defied focus, forms that seemed to be made of smoke and shadow and fractured light. One seemed to be a tangle of ever-changing limbs, another a single unblinking eye that swiveled slowly to track his movement on the catwalk. They were not alive in any sense, he understood, but they were not inert. They were specimens, experiments. The air around these fields crackled with a palpable sense of violation, a reality being forced to host tenants from a place where its laws did not apply. This was not just a machine stabilizing space-time. This was a laboratory actively prying it open, probing the wounds, and keeping the results in jars of pure energy. The logic of his world had no purchase here. He was standing in a cathedral dedicated to the defiance of everything he had ever believed was real. The logic of the world had dissolved into the churning, chaotic symphony of the machine. Alex stood frozen on the catwalk, his mind reeling from the sight of the containment fields and their impossible shifting prisoners. The air was so thick with power, it felt like wading through syrup, each breath a conscious effort against the pressure. The metallic ozone taste was a constant, acrid presence on his tongue, and the hum was no longer a sound but a physical vibration that seemed to be rearranging his very molecules. He had come for proof, but the proof was too vast, too alien to be captured by the simple mechanical camera hanging heavy around his neck. He was an archaeologist who had dug too deep and found not bones, but the living, beating heart of a god. He forced his trembling legs to move, edging further along the catwalk, drawn toward the center of the colossal chamber where the latticework of energy was most dense. The floating spheres there were moving faster now, their orbits tightening, their liquid metal surfaces churning, as if in anticipation. The central void they encircled began to pulse with a deep, violet light, a rhythm that was slow and deliberate, like the heartbeat of a sleeping leviathan. The high-pitched whine escalated, piercing through the lower frequencies, a needle of pure sensation drilling directly into his brain. He felt a sudden, vertiginous lurch, as if the floor had dropped an inch beneath his feet. The air pressure popped in his ears, and the world seemed to stretch. It started as a distortion in the center of the violet light, a shimmering like heat haze over asphalt. But this was no mirage. The space within the lattice of energy began to warp, to fold in on itself. The air tore. It was not a loud sound, but a profound one. A visceral, subaudible rip that he felt in the marrow of his bones. Where there had been a void, there was now window, a tear in the fabric of reality, just as Dr. Thorne's journal had described. Through the shimmering, unstable aperture, Alex saw another world. The glimpse was fleeting, fractured, as if seen through a kaleidoscope made of cracked glass, but it was enough to sear his soul. The landscape was a nightmare of non-Euclidean geometry. Jagged black mountains twisted in spirals against a sky the color of a fresh bruise, lit by two sickly green suns that hung motionless in impossible positions. Things moved in that landscape fast, shadowy forms that slid between the twisted rock spires, their shapes suggesting limbs and bodies that conformed to a physics of pure madness. The light from the portal cast long, writhing shadows across the chamber, shadows that seemed to crawl up. The walls with a life of their own. The air that washed through the tier was frigid and carried a smell of ancient dust, alien spices, and a profound, cosmic emptiness. Reality itself seemed to groan in protest. The floor beneath him vibrated with a new violent intensity. The symbols etched into the machinery flared with a blinding white-hot light. Alex clutched the cold railing, his knuckles bone-white, his mind screaming in denial. This was not theoretical physics or paranoid ramblings in a forgotten journal. This was real. The supernatural, the otherworldly, the dimensionally adjacent. It was all confirmed in that single, horrifying glimpse. The gold, the security, the secrecy, it was all to hide the fact that Fort Knox was not a vault, but a lock on a door. And the door was open. He felt the shift not just around him, but within him. The fundamental certainty of a single solid reality, the bedrock of human existence, crumbled to dust. The world was not what he had believed. It was a fragile skin stretched over an infinite, howling chaos, and he was staring directly into the abyss. The portal flickered, the image of the alien landscape distorting like a reflection in disturbed water. And then, with another gut-wrenching lurch, it snapped shut. The violet light vanished, the spheres slowed their frantic dance, and the oppressive pressure lessened by a fraction. But the damage was done. The veil had thinned, and Alex had seen what lay behind it. He was no longer just a man with a secret. He was a man who had looked upon the true face of the cosmos, and he knew, with a certainty that would haunt him for the rest of his days, that it had looked back. The silence that rushed in to fill the void, left by the vanished portal, was more terrifying than the howl of the Seal IDA had been. It was a fragile, pregnant quiet, broken only by the returning steady thrum of the machinery as it settled back into its role as warden. But the peace was a lie. Alex remained frozen on the catwalk, his body rigid, his mind a shattered mosaic of green suns and spiraling mountains. The after-image of the otherworldly landscape was burned onto his retinas, a permanent scar across his perception. He had not just seen the truth, he had felt it, a cold, alien wind that had blown through the tear and into his soul. The camera around his neck felt absurd, a child's toy offered to a god. What photograph could possibly capture the unraveling of the universe? A single jarring clang echoed through the cavernous space, the sound of metal on metal from somewhere high above him. It was not part of the machine's symphony. It was a human sound, a mistake. His head snapped up, the spell of cosmic horror broken by the immediate, primal terror of discovery. His eyes, wide and straining, scanned the upper gantries, the shadows between the pulsating crystals. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, a red dot appeared on his chest, a tiny, malevolent eye. It danced for a second over his heart before settling, a pinprick of laser sight that carried the weight of a final judgment. The shriek of the alarm was a physical assault, a deafening, multi-toned klaxon that ripped through the chamber's drone. Stark, white emergency lights flared to life, banishing the eerie glow of the machinery and casting the entire cavern in a harsh, unforgiving glare. Shadows fled, leaving no place to hide. From the access shaft he had descended, from corridors he hadn't even seen, figures poured onto the catwalks. They were clad in black tactical gear, their faces obscured by helmets, moving with a fluid, predatory grace. They were not facility security, they were something else. A specialized unit whose very existence spoke to the magnitude of the secret they protected. Alex's body reacted before his mind could. He turned to run, a futile, instinctual flight. But the catwalk was a trap. They were ahead of him, behind him, above him. He was surrounded in seconds. Rough hands seized him, yanking, his arms behind his back. The cold, hard click of handcuffs, locking around his wrists, was a more final sound than the seal of the portal. The vintage camera was ripped from his neck, the strap snapping with a sharp crack. He was slammed face first against the cold metal railing, the impact jarring his teeth. The taste of blood joined the ozone in his mouth. He struggled, a brief, useless flailing against their immovable strength. A blow to his kidney sent a lightning bolt of agony through his side, and his legs buckled. They did not speak, these faceless men. They communicated in grunts and efficient, brutal movements. He was hauled upright, his feet scrambling for purchase on the grate. He caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the dark visor of the man holding him, a pale, terrified face, eyes wild with a horror that was now both existential and brutally immediate. They dragged him away from the heart of the machine. His exploration ended, not with a whisper of understanding, but with the brute force of capture. His boots scraped uselessly against the catwalk as they half-carried, half-marched him back toward the access shaft. The journey upward was a blur of pain and disorientation, the humming machinery now a mocking chorus to his failure. He had come to steal a piece of the abyss, and instead, the abyss had reached out with a black-gloved hand and taken him. The fear was no longer a philosophical dread. It was a cold, hard certainty in his gut. He was now a specimen, like the shifting things in the containment fields, and he was being taken to be studied, silenced, and stored away, another ghost to be forgotten in the deep, dark heart of Fort Knox. The room they brought him to was a study in sterile psychological pressure, windowless, soundproofed, and lit by a single harsh fluorescent bar overhead. It contained only a metal table and 2 chairs. The handcuffs were removed, but the ache in his wrists and the throbbing pain in his kidney were constant reminders of his powerlessness. He sat for what felt like hours, the silence a heavy blanket smothering him, his mind replaying the sea lie of reality and the cold efficiency of his capture on an endless, torturous loop. He expected violence, interrogation, the grim finality he had read about in Thorne's journal. He expected to become a ghost. The door opened with a soft, pneumatic hiss. The man who entered was not dressed in tactical gear. He wore the crisp, perfectly pressed dress uniform of a United States Army colonel, his chest a tapestry of service ribbons, his hair a buzz cut of silvered steel. He moved with an unnerving quietness, placing a simple file folder on the table before taking the seat opposite Alex. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they held no anger, no threat, only a calm, assessing intelligence that was somehow more terrifying than any show of force. This was not a man who needed to shout. His authority was a settled, immutable fact. He introduced himself as Colonel Morrison. His voice was even, measured, a tool used for precision, not intimidation. He did not ask questions. Instead, he opened the folder. Inside were Alex's own sketches, the symbols from the chamber rendered in his own frantic hand. There were also grainy, black and white stills, captured from security feeds, showing him on the gantry, in the tunnel, his face a mask of terrified awe. And finally, lying atop the pile like a damning epitaph, was Dr. Horace Thorne's journal. Colonel Morrison began to speak, and his explanation was more shattering than any confession of guilt or threat of punishment. He confirmed everything. The gold was a lie, a story, a psychological and physical anchor for a truth the world was not ready to bear. Fort Knox, he said, was not a depository. It was a fortress in the most literal sense, the front line in a silent, desperate war that had been raging since the final days of World War II. The machinery Alex had seen was the M-theoretic stabilizer, a device born from forbidden physics, recovered from the ashes of the Third Reich's occult obsessions, and refined through decades of unimaginable effort. Its purpose was not to generate power, but to enforce it, to maintain a stable bubble of local space-time, a safe zone in a cosmos that was by its nature fluid, chaotic, and riddled with weak points. The hum was the sound of that enforcement, a constant, monumental effort to hold the line against the entropic pressure from the other side. The glimpses Alex had seen, the tears Thorne documented, were not malfunctions, but skirmishes. Brief, contained breaches in a border that was under perpetual siege. The things in the containment fields were not experiments, but intruders' echoes and fragments of what lay beyond, captured and studied to better understand the enemy. Colonel Morrison's gaze never wavered. He spoke of the immense soul-crushing responsibility, the burden of knowing that the stability of reality in the continental United States, perhaps the entire world, depended on the relentless, silent operation of the machine buried beneath the Kentucky bedrock. And then he made the offer. Alex's curiosity, his intelligence, his demonstrated ability to operate under extreme duress and find truths others missed, these were not liabilities, they were assets. They were offering him a role, not as a contractor, but as a member of the project. He would be brought inside, his silence ensured not by threat, but by oath. He would help them maintain the lock on the door. The moral dilemma descended upon Alex, with the weight of the mountain above them. It was a chance for purpose, for meaning on a scale he had never dreamed possible. It was a pardon, a validation of his dangerous quest. But it was also a surrender. It meant accepting the lie, becoming a guardian of the very secrecy that had driven Thorn mad. It meant looking away from the terrifying truth of a fractured cosmos and focusing only on keeping the pieces from falling apart. He would be given everything: clearance, purpose, an answer to his financial woes in exchange for his complicity in the greatest deception ever perpetrated. He would be saved, but only by agreeing to live the rest of his life in the gilded cage of the world's most terrible secret. The silence in the sterile room stretched, thin and taut as a wire, after Colonel Morrison's offer settled between them. The Colonel's wintry eyes remained fixed on Alex, waiting, his calm and unassailable fortress. Inside Alex, a war raged, silent and desperate. The Colonel's explanation had been a key, slotting into the chaotic lock of his recent experiences and turning with a final, terrifying click. The madness had a purpose. The horror had a reason, and they were offering him a place within that reason. A seat at the table of gods who held back the dark. It was a seductive, dizzying prospect, to trade his fear for power, his confusion for clarity, his poverty for a purpose that dwarfed all human concerns. But then the ghost stirred. The image of Dr. Aris Thorne's journal, its final pages a frantic, spidery scroll of a mind coming undone, rose in his mind's eye. He remembered the specific, chilling phrase, "The hum is not the sound of the machine working. It is the sound of the thing on the other side, pushing back." Joining them meant accepting their reality, their interpretation. It meant believing the hum was a bulwark, not a pressure. It meant dismissing Thorne's dissent as the price of failure, not the cost of truth. To become one of them was to agree that sanity was the acceptance of their narrative, and that any deviation was a pathology to be managed or erased. He thought of the things in the containment fields, the shifting, nightmarish forms held in jars of light. Were they enemies, as Morrison claimed, or were they something else? Prisoners? Refugees? Specimens of realities that were simply other. By joining, he would be pledging to keep them caged, to see them only as threats to be contained, their very existence a problem to be solved. He would be helping to maintain a prison whose walls were the fabric of reality itself, and whose warden was a machine whose true nature he still did not fully comprehend. The weight of the Colonel's offer was the weight of a gilded cage. It promised security, importance, and an end to the gnawing uncertainty. But the price was his freedom, not just the freedom of movement, but the freedom of thought. It was the freedom to question, to doubt, to seek his own truth. They were not offering him knowledge. They were offering him a doctrine. To accept was to surrender his mind, to willingly step into the role of a guardian of the lie, to spend the rest of his life pretending the world was solid while knowing, in his heart, that it was fragile as glass and crawling with things from the cracks. His own financial struggles, the desperate hope that had led him here, felt trivial, pathetic. They were leverage, a hook to ensure his compliance. They would own him, body and soul. He would become another silent, efficient cog in the machine, his curiosity neutered, his rebellion channeled into maintenance. He would be safe, comfortable, and utterly, completely lost. Alex looked from the Colonel's impassive face to the damning evidence in the folder, his sketches, Thorne's journal. These were not the artifacts of a criminal. They were the fragments of a truth too vast and terrible to be contained. To join them would be to betray that truth. It would be to betray Thorne, the ghost whose torch he had inadvertently picked up. It would be to betray himself, and the part of him that had risked everything to see what was hidden in the dark. The decision crystallized within him, cold and hard and absolute. It was not a choice born of courage, but of a fundamental, unyielding refusal. He could not live inside their lie. He could not spend his life polishing the lock on a door he believed should at least be acknowledged. The cost of that security was his soul, and it was a price he would not pay. He met Colonel Morrison's gaze, and in that moment, the last vestiges of fear were burned away by a clear, cold flame of resolve. He would not join them. He would escape. He would take the terrifying, fractured truth he had witnessed, and he would carry it out of this granite mountain. He would protect his freedom to think, to question, and to speak, even if the world called him a madman. The truth, however terrible, was his to bear, not theirs to bury. His silence was the only thing of value he had left, and he vowed, in the sterile, silent room, that he would not give it to them. The Colonel's wintry eyes narrowed a fraction, a crack in the fortress of his composure, as Alex's refusal hung in the sterile air between them. It was not a spoken word, but a communicated certainty that passed from Alex's resolute gaze to the Colonel's calculating mind. The offer had been made and rejected. The machinery of containment would now engage in earnest. Morrison gave a single, almost imperceptible nod to the one-way mirror, and the door hissed open. Two of the faceless tactical guards entered, their presence a return to the language of brute force. The handcuffs were snapped back onto Alex's wrists, the cold metal biting into his already bruised skin. He was pulled to his feet and marched from the room, not back toward the interrogation block, but deeper into the administrative heart of the facility, toward the holding cells he knew awaited him. They moved through a corridor lined with numbered, reinforced doors, the air smelling of antiseptic and despair. His mind, however, was not on his impending incarceration. It was racing, sifting through the fragmented clues of Dr. Thorne's journal. In one of the later, more coherent entries, Thorne had written of a guard, a man named Evans, who had shown a flicker of unease, a moment of shared, silent horror during a minor resonance event. Thorne had scribbled a single, hopeful, yet desperate line. Evans, B shift. He sees it too. A crack in the armor of their conviction. It was a thin reed, a phantom hope, but it was the only one Alex had. He was shoved into a sparse, windowless cell. The door clanged shut, the sound final and absolute, the lock engaging with a heavy, electronic thud. He was alone. The hum, a muted presence through the thick walls. A ghost of the monstrous reality, just levels below. He sat on the hard bunk, his head in his hands, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had chosen truth over security, and now he would pay the price in a small white box, his mind and memories slowly eroding under the weight of the secret, just like thorn. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the delivery of a bland meal on a plastic tray. As a guard slid the tray through a slot in the door, Alex caught a glimpse of the name stitched on his uniform, Evans. His heart slammed against his ribs. It was him. The man was older than Alex had imagined, with a tired, weathered face and eyes that held a deep, settled weariness. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Alex did not speak, did not plead. He simply held the man's gaze, letting him see the raw, unvarnished terror, and understanding there, the same understanding Thorn must have possessed. Later, during the quietest hour of the night shift, a soft scratching came at the door. Alex was on his feet in an instant. The electronic lock disengaged with a quiet click, not the usual heavy thud. The door opened just enough for Evans to slip inside. The guard's face was pale, his jaw tight. He held a finger to his lips, his eyes wide with a fear that mirrored Alex's own. In his hand was a key card and a small folded map drawn on a scrap of paper. He thrust them into Alex's hands, his voice a barely audible whisper. Thorn was a good man. Don't end up like him. The service tunnels. Map leads to an old overflow drain. Goes outside the perimeter. Go. Now. There was no time for gratitude, for questions. Evans's act was one of profound, career-ending risk, a spark of conscience in the oppressive dark. He turned and was gone, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving Alex alone with a chance he had not dared to believe in. The escape was a blur of tense, heart-pounding motion. The keycard granted him access to a little-used service elevator that descended into the bowels of the facility, away from the main chambers, and into a network of dusty, steam-filled maintenance tunnels. The map was crude, but accurate, leading him through a labyrinth of dripping pipes and humming electrical conduits. Every distant footfall, every echo, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through him. He moved like a ghost, his senses screaming, expecting at any moment for alarms to blare and for the relentless pursuit to begin. He found the drain exactly where the map indicated, a large, circular outflow pipe, half filled with sluggish, foul-smelling water, hidden behind a stack of crumbling concrete sacks. The grate was old, its bolts rusted. Using a length of discarded pipe as a lever, he put all his weight into it, muscles straining, the metal groaning in protest, before finally giving way with a shriek of tortured iron that seemed to echo for miles. He didn't look back. He plunged into the icy, knee-deep water, wading into the absolute darkness, the only light the faint, green glow of a chemical light stick he had taken from a maintenance cart. The tunnel seemed endless, a sloshing, claustrophobic nightmare. The hum of the facility faded, replaced by the dripping of water and the frantic beating of his own heart. He stumbled on, his courage a flickering flame fed by sheer desperation. After what felt like an eternity, he saw a pinprick of light ahead, faint and gray. Dawn. He pushed forward, his legs burning, until he emerged, gasping and shivering, into a drainage ditch choked with weeds, well beyond the final perimeter fence. The cool, clean air of the Kentucky morning filled his lungs, a taste of freedom so sweet it brought tears to his eyes. He was out. He had escaped the granite mountain and the terrible truth it contained, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the chase was only just beginning. The world outside the fence was a blur of adrenaline and primal fear. Alex did not stop running until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give way, collapsing only when the tree line was thick enough to swallow him whole. He lay panting in the damp leaf litter, the scent of pine and earth, a shocking contrast to the sterile, ozone-tainted air of the tunnels. Every rustle of a squirrel, every distant call of a bird was a potential footstep, a shouted command. He was a rabbit flushed from its warren, his senses screaming, his body vibrating with the aftershock of his desperate flight. The hum was gone, replaced by the ringing in his ears and the frantic, hammering rhythm of his own heart. But the silence of the woods felt just as oppressive, a vacuum, waiting to be filled by the sound of pursuit. He moved with a fugitive's instinct, keeping to the deepest shadows, avoiding roads and open fields. His destination was a memory, a place mentioned once in passing by an old transient co-worker, a derelict hunting cabin deep in the state forest, forgotten by tax records and park rangers alike. He found it as the sun began to set. A skeletal structure of weathered gray wood slumped against a hillside like a tired old man. The door hung from one hinge, and the interior was a tomb of dust, cobwebs, and the skeletons of small animals. It was perfect. It was nowhere. For the first 24 hours he did nothing but sleep, the exhaustion a weight that pinned him to the bare, musty mattress he found in a corner. His dreams were chaotic tapestries, woven from green suns, shifting shadows, and the cold, assessing eyes of Colonel Morrison. He would wake with a gasp, drenched in cold sweat, the line between the nightmare and his waking reality terrifyingly thin. The cabin, with its peeling wallpaper and the sigh of the wind through its broken windows, became his entire universe, a fragile bubble of temporary safety in a world that had been revealed as a lie. When the sharp edge of his panic had dulled to a constant, grinding anxiety, he began his work. He emptied his backpack onto a rickety table, the contents a pitiful arsenal against the might of the secret he carried. Dr. Thorne's journal, its cover stained and warped. His own notepad filled with sketches of impossible symbols. The map Evans had given him, now crumpled and smudged. And his mind, a repository of the most terrifying sight a human could witness, the sea lie of reality itself. This was his evidence. This was the truth he had to compile. He started with the journal, transcribing Thorne's most critical entries onto fresh pages, adding his own annotations, connecting Thorne's theoretical fears to his own visceral experiences. He redrew the symbols with a painstaking hand, trying to capture their unsettling non-Euclidean essence. He wrote a narrative of his own, a cold, clinical account of what he had seen in the deep chamber, the machinery, the containment fields, the portal, the otherworldly landscape. He forced himself to relive every moment, the act of writing a form of psychological self-surgery, draining the horror from his mind and onto the paper. He was building a case, not for a court of law, but for the court of public disbelief. He was documenting the cost of knowledge, and the price was etched into every trembling line he wrote. As he worked, the ghost of Aris Thorne was his constant companion, He wasn't just compiling evidence. He was continuing the dead man's work, ensuring that this time the truth would not die in a rusty locker in the dark. He reflected on the staggering cost. Thorne had lost his sanity and his life. He, Alex, had lost his freedom. His future, his very identity. He was now a ghost himself, a non-person who would be hunted for the rest of his days for the crime of knowing too much. The simplicity of his old life, the worries about bills, the quiet desperation of unemployment felt like a paradise lost, a blissful ignorance he would never know again. The plan solidified as the stack of papers grew. He could not walk into a newspaper office or contact a journalist. That would be a swift and final end. The leak had to be anonymous, untraceable, a digital ghost. He would need to travel to find a library or an internet cafe in a large, anonymous city, far from Kentucky. He would use a public computer, a temporary email address, and scatter his account across the darkest, most resilient corners of the internet encrypted forums, obscure data havens. Anywhere, the long arm of Morrison's organization might be slow to reach. He would be a voice crying out in the wilderness, his story dismissed as the ravings of a conspiracy theorist. A modern-day tall tale. But it would be out there. The seed would be planted. It would wait dormant for the next curious soul, the next person who noticed a loose thread in the fabric of their world and dared to pull. He was sacrificing himself, not for fame or vindication, but to become a warning, a footnote in the hidden history of the world, a testament to the terrifying price of pulling back the curtain and seeing the engine that truly drove the universe. The public library in a nameless city 2 states away was a cathedral of quiet normalcy, its air smelling of old paper and floor polish, a world away from the ozone and dread of the underground chamber. Alex sat in a secluded carrel, his hood pulled low over his face, his fingers hovering over the keyboard of a shared computer. The stack of transcribed notes, annotated sketches, and his own harrowing narrative sat in a worn manila envelope on his lap, a physical weight that felt as heavy as the mountain he had escaped. This was the moment, the culmination of his flight, his fear, his resolve. He was about to cast his story, his truth, into the vast, indifferent ocean of the internet. He worked with a fugitive's paranoia, using a bootable operating system from a USB drive that would leave no trace on the machine. He created a series of anonymous, encrypted email accounts, his movements swift and practiced, one by one. He attached the scanned documents, the symbols, Thorne's journal entries, his own account of the pulsating machinery and the sea lie in reality. He wrote a brief, stark summary, a headline for the end of the world. The truth beneath Fort Knox. Not gold, but a cage. Then he began to send them. To mods of obscure conspiracy forums, to the anonymous tip lines of fringe news sites, to every digital dead drop in data haven he had researched during his days hiding in the cabin. Each click of the send button was a release, a letting go. He was setting his ghost adrift, hoping it would find purchase in some curious mind. For a few days, a fragile, impossible hope flickered within him. He checked the forums from different libraries, using different computers, his heart pounding each time. The posts appeared. For a handful of hours, they generated activity. The responses began to trickle in. He watched, his breath held, as the world reacted to the truth he had almost died to expose. The reaction was not shock or outrage or terrified belief. It was dismissal, a chorus of digital ridicule. The posts were quickly buried under mockery and memes. Commenters called him a la-pur, a sicko, a glowy, trying to discredit real researchers. They picked apart his symbols, comparing them to video game lore and heavy metal album art. They called his narrative bad sci-fi, and his description of the portal a DMT trip written by a teenager. The few who engaged seriously did so only to debunk, to explain away the power fluctuations as faulty wiring and the otherworldly landscape as a hypnagogic hallucination brought on by stress. His life's most terrifying, transformative truth was being neatly categorized, labeled, and filed away in the cabinet of modern mythology, right next to flat earth theories and fake moon landings. The fortress of secrecy was not made of granite and steel, but of human incredulity, and it was more impenetrable than any vault. The hope died, replaced by a cold, hollow understanding. He had not escaped to become a hero or a revolutionary. He had escaped to become a punchline. The legacy of his discovery of form sacrifice, of his own shattered sanity, was to be a digital ghost, a story told to scare newcomers on internet forums. He left the city, drifting from one anonymous motel to another, paying in cash, his existence reduced to a series of rented rooms and constant, low-grade vigilance. He saw Colonel Morrison's face in every stranger, heard the facility's hum in the drone of every highway. He was forever changed. The man who had worried about bills and a fresh start was gone, replaced by a specter who knew the universe's darkest secret. The world around him, the bustling streets, the smiling faces on television, the solid ground beneath his feet, was now a beautiful, terrifying illusion. He lived in the space between the world everyone saw and the terrifying reality he knew pulsed just beneath its skin. Fort Knox, in the end, had succeeded. It had protected its secret not with guns and guards, but with a far more effective weapon of human disbelief. And Alex, the sole inheritor of its terrible truth, was condemned to live out his days in the silent, solitary knowledge that the nation's greatest treasure was not gold, but the desperate humming lock on a door that must never ever be opened. His legacy was not fame or revolution, but the crushing, lonely weight of a revelation that had changed everything for him and nothing for the world.